Well, let's start. First of all, thank you for sharing. Good morning.
Good morning.
One of the most common assumptions that we do when we do research is that you have to investigate something. If you want to know something about a phenomenon, you have to go deep to find its essence, its basic and intricate structure. Adultery, also known as reductionism. However, development, infant action development, and indeed any and every action development is a matter of understanding how many and different things relate to each other. How these relationships leads to emergencies and transitions between the states of a given developmental system. We have seen many examples of such developmental systems yesterday. Today, we will be lucky enough to listen a proposition of a theory of relations that gets rid of dualisms between the individual and the environment, between the brain and the ego. Professor Ruud van der Wiel has been challenging dualisms and reductionism since his master's degree on the secret sixth sense.
Yeah, you remember that.
Yeah, he presented to the Faculty of Human Movement Sciences long time ago, I will not say the year, in Amsterdam, Holland. He pursued these ideas further in Edinburgh, where he got his PhD, also under the guidance of David Lee, and there he became a lecturer and semi-lecturer at the university. By the middle of the 1990s, he went to Norway at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology in Trondheim to get a position as a professor of cognitive psychology, which he holds to this day. As I said yesterday, he also runs the Developmental Neuroscience Lab together with Oliver. He has a background in physical education and has done a lot of interesting research in sport, applying ecological psychology. Ruud has a path that crosses over disciplines, from psychology to biology, from biology to philosophy. Spread out in different interests, from babies to children with atypical development, from common people to athletes. He's also a father of 5, and I can say, maybe other may say otherwise, but I can say he's a dedicated father. It has been a privilege to know him and be able to listen to him in the way he combines in-depth knowledge with clever, practical experience. If historians ever went deep in the history of the study of motor behavior, they will probably describe a renaissance period between the 1980s and the early 1990s that happened in some places. 2 of them were in Amsterdam and Edinburgh. Ruud, as well as Audrey, took part in this period as active postgraduate students and then as young lecturers. So, without further ado, please welcome Professor Ruud van der Wiel.
Thank you very much, Edson. You all said it. There's nothing to add, really. There's not so many people here today as yesterday, but I do see that the most important people are so welcome to this talk. And as Edson mentioned, and yesterday. My background is in physical education a long time ago, where I had these problems understanding in doing sports myself, in understanding the relation, what I now know is cognition and perception. That in some instances, cognition is in the way of doing good sports performance. So that is the simple question that led me all the way to today, where I try to introduce the brain into ecological psychology. Because ecological psychology is, since Gibson, a very important part of psychology as far as I'm concerned. But it has been satisfied by determining the relationships between the observer or the sporter and the environment. Finding out variables, for example, time to contact information via the variable tau, can be picked up directly from the environment. They have argued for a long time that that is their aim of the study, making sense of the relationship between the individual and the environment, and finding relationships. In other words, they say, we don't need the brain in this, because we have lots to do in finding these variables. And it is very important work. But with the increase of technological advances, where we can look at the brain while babies or children or adults are doing kind of meaningful tasks, it may be about time to not neglect the brain any longer, and thereby signaling to the neurosciences that we are not interested in the brain, and the brain is making ridiculous of ecological psychology. They don't say we have a brain. I think it's about time to include that brain in the ecological story by applying ecological psychology principles to the brain, such that we can include it and make a more credible story as how we can coordinate our movements in an environment using variables in the array, but also how the brain is dealing with these variables in ecological ways. And what I mean by that, I will go through how I see the neurosciences are treating the brain, and how ecological psychology might treat the brain in their story. So this is where we do all that research in this lab. What's difficult to see here in our Nevrovitenskapelige neuroscience laboratory, which is, if you ever want to visit us, here in Norway. Here is Oslo, and here in this area there is Trondheim, and Norway is obviously here. So that's where we are when we do these experiments. And then you might ask, what is this guy doing here? Well, this is a stationary picture of a boy kicking a ball towards you. And because it's stationary, there's not much information to be gained from that picture in order for you to decide when it is going to hit you. So it's not always an easy task when a ball comes towards you like this, as maybe this picture, this slide may show, how sometimes judging the information using in the expanding optic ball, how difficult it is to to avoid it. Okay, so this is the kind of basis. It is a real task, a ball coming towards you at fairly high speed, and then you have to react in order to blink with your eyes or withdraw your head, etc. So it's a real task. We come across in many sporting situations. So we adapted that to a child or baby friendly version in the form of this looming experiment on our daughter Leah in the beginning, when we just had our first try and looking at what kind of experiments we would be able to do. We found out that the looming stimulus that we worked on before without the EEG on was a really good start of doing these experiments, because it seems to be really real to babies. If they are sitting in the chair and they see something getting bigger at them, they think it is a real stimulus, so they react in a real way. And in addition, it turns out that this big visual stimulus produces an enormous effect in the occipital visual area on a single trial basis. Now that's very uncommon in EEG research, because there's a level of noise to signal ratio is very low. So in many cases with EEG you have to repeat things like 20, 40, 60, 100 times until the noise level gets better and better and better. And in adults you would only see it after many trials. But in babies, presumably because of their thin skulls and no hair, etc., we find it in every single trial, which is great because you can actually do analysis on single trials rather than averages, which is good. You have a direct measure. So this is the setup of this experiment, where the baby is sitting in a chair and in front of this big projection screen, and it will grow from a very small loom to a very large ball in 3 different conditions. In 2 seconds, that's a fast one, 3 seconds, or 4 seconds. And that's kind of crucial to remember, that we always have 3 different speeds, because we then can analyze how the baby is reacting to the various speeds and how well or not well they're doing. So this is how the baby sits in the chair, and we analyze, we pick up all these electricity from the cortex here. And this is to give you an indication of the experiment, how the same baby reacts when they're 5 months and the same baby when they're 12 months. And you see how if you see the next picture, how the brain is changing. So there will be a stimulus coming up here soon, and then things happen in these areas of the brain when the baby is looking at it. There it is. 5 months early, 12 months changes to a slightly different place and more to the parietal areas. So there's more, presumably, well, let's call it processing going on. So this is the latest analysis we've done in trying to find out what is happening in these babies' brain when these color changes are happening. Now you could argue the information from the stimulus needs to be processed, so it's first picked up in the occipital lobe And after that, in about a year, it's progressing towards the parietal areas, a little higher up, where supposedly there is processing going on. Now, but what do I mean by processing? Because in this slide, we see the perceived looms between 5 and 12 months. And you see here, when we look at, when we have so we see a difference when we have the 5 months and the 12 months, and you subtract the one from the other. What you see at 12 months is these areas are suddenly getting involved. So that is the big thing. So maybe when Audrey was talking about self-produced locomotion, during that time, 5 and 12 months, there have been lots of self-produced locomotion going on, and suddenly the brain in this area, on the basis of the loom, are getting more active. So that means that connectivity means that different places seem to work together. They oscillate in this area, and they oscillate in this area at the same frequency, at the same time interval. Suddenly, at two places in the head, things start happening together. That's what connectivity about. Because if things oscillate together at the same time, it means the brain is working on something that is ongoing. It's only a few milliseconds usually, but it finds this program connectivity areas for the looming stimulus. Now the main question I'd like to answer here in respect to ecological psychology is what is going on here can be seen as enrichment of information, which means somewhere in these areas that are oscillating together, what is happening there? What exactly do we mean by the baby's brain is processing the stimulus, the looming stimulus? What do we mean by that? Does it add extra information? Does it mean it goes to a kind of network and is there processed further? Or can we do this same story in terms of differentiation? So how is the brain reacting to the stimulus that are the stimulus information that is extracted from the array? So that is the main question. So we have a kind of fact. There's something going on here. But the thing is, to make it ecological, is what is going on here? And that's where we take a few steps back and argue that in more traditional senses, in the neurosciences, in cognitive psychology, what happens is, here is the looming information in X1, which is said to be meaningless. Stimulus out there, when it's out there, doesn't carry any meaning, it's chaotic, it's just pinpricks of light in a chaotic situation. That is the assumption of the neurosciences when they start defining the perceptual process. Then in X2, obviously, you have the eyes, the ears, and whatever more. There, this chaotic information is, via the retina, turned into electricity. That's what all the senses do in a nutshell. They all turn mechanical stimulus information into electricity. That's the language of the brain, so to speak. And it's only when the mind gets involved between X2 and X3 where the meaning is so-called added. So we add meaning to meaningless stimulation. But the presupposition is that the information out there is meaningless. It's only this brain that adds that meaning. And therefore we enrich information, because we may be bored, because there are several ways to explain this enriching process. You can either be born with that sort of knowledge, as Descartes argued, and Chomsky with his chimps. So you're born with a kind of ability to do that, to enrich information that was poor, that needs to be in X3. Here, that knowledge must be, and you can be born with that, or you can acquire that from the first day that you are born. You can start writing on this tabula rasa via reflexes. We talked about that yesterday already. So that's another way of using X3. By the information that you have learned, you start adding that information. Or the well-known interactionism by Piaget, which is of course a combination of the nativistic theories and the empiristic theories combined together, such that there's an interactive process going in these schemas, for example, how from the different gazing, reaching and ordering is going up to this new skill. But all are about enriching the information. These three possibilities, nativism, empirism, interactionism, they are quite different in their way they explain how we perceive. But they all do agree upon the fact that the information in X1 is poor. And all we have to do to make it rich is through nativism, empirism or interactionism, to make it sensible. So they all are vastly different, but they do agree upon the fact that the information we pick up is poor and chaotic. But we shouldn't forget, because that will be a major difference with ecological psychology. Because when you don't take that assumption that information is very poor, but if you say information is really, really rich, then the way the brain is involved in that process is vastly different. So in both cases, we have the brain in the process, but what the brain actually does is quite different. So and then in this indirect perception, there's usually another, so we have a word, or we learn, or an interactionist idea, and then from the top down, usually we make up via Gestalt principles, and we make sort of, we start building from our knowledge, from our data bank, from our big computer, we start building up a mental representation of what we are looking at, a ball that's coming towards us. You need to have that information about speed and everything. You calculate everything about the speed, you pick up the speed that is coming, and the distance and the velocity, and you divide, all in the big processor. But that's upon the fact that information is poor, and the perceiver has to calculate its way to closing your eyes by mentally making all these calculations. And this is a very ingrained, traditional way of thinking about perception. It's no secret, it is just here. Information available to our eyes, X1, is not sufficient by itself to provide the brain with its unique interpretation of the visual world. The information in itself, in X1, doesn't cut it. You have to have this X3 processes Many people say, and you hear it on the internet every day, we are hallucinating all day. So we are making up our own world because of this assumption that information is poor. And here, not so long ago, in a reputable journal, it's explicit. Also here, this is not so long ago. Here is a picture of the Mona Lisa, and here is a representation of the picture of the Mona Lisa through this process. And these people have the problem of, we only have a few really big neurons or what have you in the retina, and we have to make this very detailed picture. So on the way, the number of neurons have to increase. So from a small number of neurons to many neurons, there is to be some kind of processing necessary to be able to do that. In this case, is the information from the eye passes through the bottleneck, the LGN, in the brain, before it gets to the brain's visual cortex, which is here, which heavily processes the sparse, the very simple signal from here. So for every 10 LGN neurons that go back from the retina, these here, there are 4,000 neurons in just the initial input layer of the visual cortex. So it needs to be kind of amplified on the basis of brain process. And they, like 2 or 3 years ago, come up with some kind of feed-forward process. But it's processing. It is enriching this poor information into this very difficult picture. And the brain only, inside the brain, is responsible for that. They created the first anatomically accurate model that explains how vision is possible. Here, it says a lot of things that you think you see, you're actually making up. A mathematician at New York. We don't actually see them, that's the hallucination part. So we make them up, we enrich it. And this is the basis of the neurosciences. And when you ask them how they do it, they come up with feed-forward models, and in the end, a dynamical system, a butterfly effect, which to me says, well, if you have to rely on the butterfly effect to get your Mona Lisa done, I think that's not very convincing. Okay, so that's the traditional part, where information is poor and we have to enrich it to be meaningful. Gibson, on the other hand, in ecological psychology, said, well, maybe information is not poor, and maybe that's a bad assumption, where we start off by defining how poor it is. You have to come up with an idea how it's done. So he wanted to step away from this idea and start thinking new about how we perceive. And for a start, he defined these concepts of optic array and affordances I talked a little bit about yesterday. Today I will be mainly talking about the optical array. Because then, suddenly, we are not talking about radiant light, that is the starting point for perception, but more illumination, which means we are not perceiving light directly from the sun, but we are perceiving light that is bouncing off from these lights onto the floor, onto the chairs, creating shadows. So already there is structure in that light. And for Gibson, perception is not picking up the radiant light from the light source, but the illuminative light from all the things that are illuminated through shadows and the clouds and what have you. So we start at a different end by assuming that information is not poor, but indefinitely rich. And the task for perception is to pick out that rich information. This is what you might pick out from your many drives in the town here. What type, all the arrows show you what in principle of information there is available when making a single car journey through the city. Like the white lines on the road. If you're driving long roads in the dark, if you don't have the white lines, you're in trouble. So you have this moving line with you. You can use as a guide to pick up that information for controlling your steering actions. So this is the type of structured information, according to Gibson, available in the optic array that you can use for. So you don't have to mentally calculate all these arrows, because that is what is really done in the neurosciences. You have to mentally calculate all these in order to be able to steer in the same way. And then, one step further is, okay, we have this indefinitely rich optical flow of optic array we can use for controlling our actions, but then that is only the theory behind it. And what happens after the theory was first thought of by Gibson? People thought this was a nice idea and started doing experiments trying to not prove but that these things exist, but make it plausible that we can use that sort of information. So David Lee, our supervisor, PhD supervisor in Edinburgh, was the one in the forefront like in the 70s, where he started working with the optic array. And what he did is to say, oh, if people walk into an environment, they pick up all sorts of information from trees, mountains, and the ground. And he said, well, if you take this picture here, this is the projection plane of the eye, the retina, in the middle of the eye. And this is a kind of object moving towards the eye. And you see here those triangles, when you move here, they get smaller here and they get bigger on the retina, so they expand on the retina. And according to the mathematics David Lee put on these triangles, he was claiming that the expansion pattern of something moving towards you on the retina is providing the observer with time to contact information for free. So you don't have to pick up the distance to the object, the velocity to the object, divide one by the other to get the time to contact. No, he said by just expanding pattern on the retina, it's given that time is coming out of that equation for free. So there was the first hint that using rich information from the environment is available for free for us to control something simple like time to contact. It's a simple variable, but we use it all day and every day. We need to pick up something, that's time to contact, we need to open a door, always time to contact is involved. And rather than making all these huge amounts of computations, distance, velocity, etc., it's there for free. Because we use the changing information in the optic array that is expanding on the retina. And this is one of the experiments that came out of that. He's a baby reaching for objects. And the young hungry. The last trial is repeated here in slow motion, and look at the anticipatory behavior of the head movements, the arm movements. Before it goes away behind the occluder, it turns away to the right place and start moving the hands ahead of time in order to be able to grasp it between the two occluders. Because if it would be starting too late and the speed of the toy would get faster and faster, they would miss it. So they have to do something ahead of time, prospective, anticipatory information. Now what turns out in these experiments is that babies always start moving the hand, for example, if the toy is a certain time window away from them. So when the object is moving fast, they start it earlier. And when the object is moving slow, they start it later. They could have taken another strategy, saying that every time the toy is reaching this point on the track, I start moving my hand. That's it. That would be a distance strategy. But they're not doing that. In the beginning, they have to adapt to it, and they may start with such a primitive strategy. But later, they develop into using a time window for them to perform the action. Now, that is not proving that the tau hypothesis, as I showed with the previous slide, is working, but it is at least consistent that time is used. Time is a more ecological variable than distance and velocity. So it is likely that something like the tau variable, providing free information, is being used in something simple like reaching for an object. And these ideas that Dave Lee produced, and we came later to the lab, start also making sense for people in the neurosciences. Because collision avoidance in a pigeon, because people wanting to investigate pigeon brains, for example, and if you are from a neuroscience point of view, if you start looking at the pigeon brain, how it handles flying away when you approach, then you may open the brain and start looking for distance detectors or velocity detectors, because that's a more traditional way of working out the time to contact. But no, because of the tau idea, people are finding now collision-like sensors in the retina of the pigeon. Already very early in, so-called early in the visual process in the retina, these neurons seems to be sensitive for looming information. So that doesn't mean it has to go all the way to the pigeon brain to be worked out when you approach it and it flies away. No, it's instant, because the retina of this pigeon is built like a collision detector. That's where we're going, trying to get ecological ways of looking at the nerve system. So that is sort of not needed to do all the processing in higher order, like in the cortex, but is done at lower levels, at early stages of the visual processing, just by picking up the expansion pattern from the approaching object. So it is getting also more popular in the neurosciences. in trying to determine these things. So what does the brain actually do when perceiving the loom? So we've now gone from the general theory and how the Tao made a good way for us to materialize this idea of optical flow, and how can we now try and find solutions for our looming problem? Because from an enrichment or a differentiational point of view, you can approach this from different angles. Traditionally, from traditional cognitive neuroscience, there is a one-to-one mapping between the brain structure and function. This is the classical neural network representation. So if we want to explain the looming, how suddenly from 5 months to 12 months, suddenly this changing happened in the baby brain, we can either say, well, there's a neural network has established in these areas for loom, the fastest loom, the middle loom, and the slow loom. So in that brain area, we have formed a kind of network, and therefore, after these 7 months of walking about, you see that there is a network, and therefore it is sort of moved from the occipital area, low down here, to the more parietal area. Because that's why supposedly these areas are being established. And therefore everything goes quicker, because they also get quicker in the looming response in the brain. Or we can maybe provide an alternative explanation in the fact that Gibson explained an ability to filter the optic array as a potential filter information through what he called resonance. So what does it mean by that? Is that you know that when you have a guitar and you pluck a string, it starts vibrating, and at the same time in the big wooden body of the guitar there's also vibration going on. And it is this combination of the string and the body of the guitar that produces the sound. And it's exactly as you see here, the strings are plucked, and you see here all the different resonating factors in the guitar body. So Gibson said, why not view the workings of the brain of an old-fashioned radio, where you have a big button on the radio, and by turning the button you tune in to the right radio station, because there are several ones, and by turning it right you establish this kind of resonating process between the radio transmitter and the receiver, and by turning it you can get a clearer resonance between the two. So that doesn't mean that everything, Now this is a nice video clip illustrating the resonance possibilities we have. I found on the internet not so long ago. So you see here that this guy is having a violin stick, and he put it somewhere along the line here, and by making small or bigger strokes you see these incredible patterns emerging on this
randomization function.
Now this, to me, may indicate some kind of process that is going on while we're perceiving things, because you can imagine how many possibilities there are in this little experiment with the long stick, and how long he did the strokes, where on the plate he did the strokes, where he held it and did the stroke. So there's thousands of possibility of having different patterns emerging from only vibration. Now the idea is that for explaining the things that happen in the looming experiment, we may find these solutions to be very nice, to have a non-dualistic way of explaining perception, because there's nothing happening on that plate of with this sand. It's just a reaction on the information, the stroke of the violin outside. So there is perception, there's perceptual invariance in the array around us, and we pick up or differentiate that information, and our nervous system is reacting in this way, resonating with that information rather than enriching that information. So let's assume that let's try and make that concrete into our experiments. Here we analyze the data from the source waveform, which means, we talked about it yesterday, we have all these electrodes on the baby's head, but there is a ball, and it needs to be a ball because you have to work your way back from all the electrodes at different sides, all the way back to a certain place where things are happening, and then the waveform is recreated by the software, so to speak. So we're not using the electrodes by themselves at the top, but we're using calculations of all the electrodes in a ball, what's happening, and therefore you need a lot of these EEG registration so that is all, there's enough information to provide reliable information about the source. So, and that is what we use, and we are coupling via the tau theory I talked about. It is generalized after what I've showed you about David Lee, but it's generalized, and we use that method to analyze the data, which we can here see the tau coupling of two variables, the source waveform, for example, and the stimulus information, are coupled if the tau of x is the tau of y, with a kind of constant in between. That's how we did it. So here are the results of these couplings, and you see here at 8 to 9 months you see a graph, but when they are young, you see when we couple the source waveform, the EEG results, with the loom itself, how it approaches the baby, and we put them in one graph, so the brain activity and the visual loom in one graph, we set them up to each other, and that's possible because normally that's very hard to do, because you have electricity and you have centimeters, which doesn't go well in one graph. But if you use the tau procedure, you make them relative to each other, you make them scalable. So therefore you can plot them together. And what you see here is that when the babies are young, 5, 7 months, they don't seem to differentiate well in the brain between the 2, the 3 and the 4-second loom. But see here, if we go upwards and they grow older, suddenly at 10, 11, about a year,
so they have been crawling around, they have been sort of interacting with the environment, they start differentiating between the three looming speeds. So you see here we measure directly in the brain the speed of the loom, which sort of with the previous slide is a kind of, there are patterns emerging, allowing the baby to distinguish between when a loom is coming fast or not so fast. So this is a kind of resonance type of graph, that there are possibilities going in that direction. This is how I like to look at it. Normal neurosciences, these are the nerves in the head, and the way the electricity is flowing is normally assumed to be equal distance between the stones. What we see here, I think, is there is a pattern in that electricity flow, in these resonance terms. So this is not so much where it happens in the brain, it matters how the things are flowing that give the information about speed of the object in this case. So this is kind of, because normally the pulses are assumed to be regular. But I think there is a lot of information to be gained from the spacing of the neural pulses. And especially in terms of resonance, I think that may provide some clues to how it's done. So this is the experiments I've been working on the last few weeks, where there is sensory integration, because we did the looming experiments again, but now we added an auditory looming stimulation as well. So instead of they only see it coming, it's growing exactly the same rate as the visual one. So we kept the rate, how it is approaching, the same between the visual and the auditory cortex. And you see here, this is when they are 5 months old. Now this is the line between the horizontal bars is the auditory information, because they are the 2 ears, and there's 2 auditory cortexes, but if you want to measure the 2 ears, it's best to measure the CZ, where they all come together. So everything you see here is the auditory information, and everything you see here is the visual information. And where it all comes together, supposedly, is the parietal area, where traditionally it is said that everything is combined. But think about it. If you see something and you hear something, so here's information and here's information, how on earth do I decide what is to be done? There needs to be some kind of, in the parietal area, a kind of decision center that says, there's a visual loop, and there's the auditory loop, so it comes at this particular speed. Because that is the consequence of having different channels of information. The more channels of information, if you are sitting with a fire, you see the fire, you hear it, you feel it, and all that information needs to be integrated in order to provide you with a concept of the fire. But that's all because we made the huge assumption of saying we have 5 senses And these 5 senses receive all their information. Now that is the problem. And I know every textbook in cognitive psychology, biological psychology, neurosciences have chapters on the 5 senses and on movement. But it's that mainly done for pedagogical purposes. So you make the assumption we have 5 senses, and therefore you need to find a solution in the brain how they are brought together. It's called, it has a special name, the binding problem. If you Google it, it's the binding problem that so-called deals with this. How this various information from the various senses are bound together. For me, I'm going back to the old homunculus theory. There needs to be something in the parietal area, a little man sitting there, getting information from the vision and the auditory and deciding, there's the loop coming. Because otherwise, I don't see how it's done. So, what we've done here is measuring the auditory signals and the visual signals, and we found out that irrespective of where you're measuring, the same slope of the coupling constant of tau of the auditory and tau of the visual loops is the same. That means that irrespective of you see or hear the looping information, the coupling constant of tau is the same. So there is no discrepancy between the visual and the auditory information. It is just the whole brain seems to be informed about it altogether. And also the motor areas we've done in another experiment are providing with the same type of coupling constant. So that means there is no optical array or acoustical array or tactical array. According to Stoffregen, ecological psychologist, argues there is just one global array around us, which sometimes when I'm walking, the visual information is very important. But if I hear something behind me, that is that redundant information. So in the global array, there's no separation for the 5 senses. Because that's, I think, is the clue to avoid dualistic perception, is by saying that there is no visual array or acoustic array. It is just one array which provides valuable or redundant information that needs to be picked up. And although it comes into the brain via the 5 channels, but that doesn't matter, because it's already picked up in a form that is resonating with the brain tissues inside. So in that way, we do not add information to the incoming stimulation. We do not combine stimulation that is integral anyway. So, but it's more a resonating process that is sort of going on. And so, we've done some more analysis about how the brain can be doing this. And there where the idea of neural reuse is coming in. So instead of having certain networks, as I was explaining earlier, in the brain responsible for the 2, the 3 and the 4-second loop, that is not the case. But neural reuse means that there is a part in the brain that is responsible for some actions, but it is reused. It is not dedicated to one particular task. It is to be reused In one task it is used in this way, in another task the same nerves are used in other ways, which helps us to solve these localization problems and storage problems. And this is what we've done with the looming stimulus. We looked at where the looming stimulus went into the head. And so when all these babies, these are 6 different subjects, you see when we analyze the looming information, it tends to go to a kind of 1 centimeter cube in the visual cortex. In all the subjects, here, here, here. So there seems to be some kind of localization in the brain. But if you think about it, our brain is very retinotopically organized, which means the way the retina is organized, with top, bottom, left, right, is kept through the whole visual system. So this may give us an idea what is happening. This may see, okay, it goes to a special area in the brain, but what happens then is that we also looked at the direction which the current, electrical current, is flowing. And then you see here around lots of more variation around this initial where it arrived. And that is about a 2 centimeter cube. So from 1 centimeter it has all these directions, which means the neurons are never the same path. It is almost as if choose an arbitrary path, and as long as the information goes through it, through a certain number of neurons in a particular way, that this resonance process is taking place. So you don't need one network or one trace to do this. It is an arbitrary area of 2 centimeters where somewhere it needs to go through, and then it's informing the system what is going on. Yeah. So, apparently, some invariant properties of the looming information are maintained in the processing of that information while traveling to the different parts of the visual cortex, informing the brain how dependent collision. Gibson explained an ability to filter the optic array as the potential to filter the information through resonance. So people are able to tune into their environments fairly automatically. So this is an alternative way of looking at the brain and how we may be able to use this different idea in areas of principles of direct learning, for example. Now I know that already many teachers, physiotherapists are using these ideas, but maybe this theoretical background gives a better theoretical framework for what you're doing. So that means every task can be reduced, because otherwise you cannot be teaching children. It needs to be reduced in some way, but it needs to be reduced in an ecological, valid way. Which means, if we are believing this resonance, then you need to have the visual input or the visual information present during the task in order for the children to be able to resonate to that information. If you are just doing motor tasks without information, with the idea of making a trace in the brain about this movement doing hundreds of thousands of times, it's wrong, because it's embedded in a perceptual environment that you need to have there in order for the resonance thing to take place as well. So you can reduce, because we need to reduce in teaching situations, the the difficulty of the job, but we need to reduce it in ecological ways. Which means there's perceptual motor learning always, and no movement training as such. Movement as such, to me, doesn't exist. It is always embedded in a perceptual motor, perceptual movement relationship, and that needs to be sort of held yeah. So there is concrete movements versus abstract movements, and there is prospective perceptual information is vital. You see the babies, when reaching for an object, they need to have moving information in order to be able to anticipate. When you practice in isolation, that information you need to control your movements is not available. So it's just merely making movements rather than interacting with a moving stimulus and picking up that information and using that. And whether that is resonance, that's the position here. And the old one, repetition without repetition. Because it's not about making this cognitive trace in the head and doing that many times again in order to form the neural network. It is providing various ways of giving the stimulus, that there are many possible varieties in the perceptual array, the global array, such that we can learn to resonate with that information, differentiate that information. And the perception-action coupling in terms of the affordances I talked about yesterday. Objects do not have affordances. Never. There is no affordances in this room without the perceiver relating to them. That's important also. So you need to define, look at affordances always in relation to the one that is acting. Otherwise it's not an affordance, it's just an object that potentially can be used to sit on. But it's not, that is not an affordance. That's the old way of looking at objects in an environment. That there are possibilities, if everybody goes out of the room, there are possibilities for sitting. You need to be relative to, with your leg length, and to be able to sit on that. So that needs a relationship between the perceiver and the object. There, the affordance is in the middle somewhere, never in the object. And I see that lots of times in the literature that this room is made of affordances. But it's not. It is the relationship. It's an emergent property in affordance, not an ability of a chair. And there is this frame of reference I briefly talked about, that we need to establish when we are learning to have this frame of reference as a starting point for our actions. Okay? So you need to be able to handle a hockey stick or a tennis racket, or even when you go to the dentist, you have done something to your tooth. The first 2 days you feel it, after a week it's gone. It's embedded in your new frame of reference. I think that is a major role in motor learning, is incorporating these things like a tennis racket so that you forget about it. It becomes part of you. And in these little babies, their hands and their legs and everything needs to be integrated. I think this is the last one. Yes, this is. Okay, so this is what I had to tell to you in this way of trying to incorporate the brain into the ecological psychology literature. Still now, many people say we don't need it. But I think to keep the ecological psychology credible in the long run, we need to have some kind of brain idea without falling back in the old dualistic that everything is carried out and worked out and calculated by the brain. We don't want that. But we need a sort of account of the brain in order to carry the ecological psychology forward. Okay?
Okay.